During graduate school, I worked at Sears. That was my brief career with Sears. And I was in the break room one day, and there were some others in there, of course. Two young men especially were there. They were discussing all the things they wanted in life. They talked about cars and clothes and other possessions. This is what they wanted in life. And we sometimes think that our life will be happier if we can get more money, a bigger house, or a new car. The things we come up with that would make our life better sometimes really aren't the best things in the long run. We usually find that these things don't make us any happier. In Genesis, the 25th chapter, we read of a man who was truly satisfied with life. He was a man who was really happy. Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8. These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people. That's the New American Standard Translation. King James Version and the New International Version, rather than saying satisfied with life, have the reading that he was full of years. Well, when we think about translation from the Hebrew to the English, basically the translator supplied of years, and so the reading would be that he died full. And in the New American Standard Translation, they supplied with life. And so the actual translation would be satisfied. What is being said in the text is that Abraham lived a full life. When he died, he was full or he was satisfied. It's someone like Freddie was saying a while ago, he had good chop. That's his term for good food. And, you get through with a meal, and if it's been a good meal, you're satisfied. Sometimes you're oversatisfied if you're not careful. But Abraham lived his life, a long life, and when he died, he was satisfied. His life had been full. Abraham had found true happiness. Now, God had earlier told Abraham, "And as for you, you shall go to your father in peace. You shall be buried at a good age." Well, we ask, what caused Abraham to be satisfied with life? What gave him that full life? Well, we could probably come up with many factors. But there are two things I think really helped Abraham have a good life. And this evening we'll look at those two factors. First, Abraham had a life of faith in God. God made several promises to Abraham. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. He promised him a new land. That would be the land of Canaan. He said he would make of him a great nation. He would bless Abraham and make his name great. And he promised, in chapter 15, he promised Abraham a son. Well, we read that Abraham trusted God. Chapter 15, verse 6, then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Another translation says, credited to him as righteousness. Abraham believed what God told him. He believed the promises that God had made to him. God took a long time to carry out some of his promises, but Abraham continued to believe in him. Now, Abraham's faith sometimes wavered. Abraham was certainly not perfect. On two occasions, Abraham practiced deception to protect himself. He was afraid. Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 20 describe two very similar occasions. And Abraham and Sarah, on the first of those, had come to Egypt. Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, This is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Well, Abraham and Sarah are in this situation. Abraham is concerned about his longevity. And so he comes up with this little white lie. This is a half-truth, because indeed Sarah was his half-sister. We have this occasion, we have a similar situation in Genesis chapter 20. It's interesting, and in both of these circumstances, God intervened to protect Sarah. He prevented Sarah from being compromised or being hurt in any way. Abraham must have thought that God needed help in protecting him. We have to remember that God does not need our help in doing anything. He is quite sufficient to protect us. Abraham also showed a lack of faith when told Sarah would have a son. Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? I think we can certainly sympathize with Abraham. Some of God's promises were difficult to believe. They're up in years. It's no longer time to be having children, not normally. At a later time, Sarah heard that she would have a child, and she also laughed. God said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? And notice what God asks. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Another reading is, anything too hard for the Lord? The answer to that, of course, would be no. God kept his promise. Isaac was born. Well, despite Abraham's imperfections, Abraham was a man of faith. When we come to the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews, to the great chapter on faith, what we might call faith's Hall of Fame, Abraham is certainly there. Chapter 11 of Hebrews, verses 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. You know, God has made promises to us. He promises us salvation, forgiveness of sins. He promises us eternal life with him. He promises to help us. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. And in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, some of God's promises take a long time to be fulfilled. Some may be even hard to believe. But we see in Abraham's example, we must trust God. We must avoid letting our faith waver. Now, sometimes we may feel that God isn't keeping his promises. God is not moving at our speed. We're like the fellow who said, I want patience and I want it right now. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. We read these words, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness. God is on his own schedule, and quite often it is not our schedule. But God will keep his promises. We need to remember that question that God asked of Abraham. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Great question. And there is a great answer. God has the ability to do anything that needs to be done. Abraham's life was made better by his faith in God. Let us also put our faith in God. Like Abraham, our faith will waver, but we must make sure our faith grows. The second factor that enabled Abraham to be satisfied with life or have a full life was that he lived a life of obedience to God. We cannot adequately discuss Abraham's faith without studying his obedience to God also. Abraham did more than believe in God and the promises God made. Abraham did what God told him to do. In James chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, James has something to say about Abraham. He said, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." James quotes the book of Genesis, quotes that statement that Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness. Yes, salvation is by faith. We do not do a thing to earn our salvation. But faith that saves is a faith that acts. Another reading is that Abraham was considered righteous for what he did. God said, "Go," Abraham went. We're going to see a couple of other examples as well. Abraham left his country to follow God. God said to Abraham, "Leave your country. Go to this land I'm going to show you." He left his country, family, and home. And he followed God to a land he knew nothing about. Debbie and I, in our life together, have made several long moves. We had the benefit of maps, of pictures, of other information about where we were going, things that Abraham did not have. And still it was hard to move to a new place. Abraham was told to go, and he went. Abraham was commanded to be circumcised, Genesis chapter 17. This would be a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. God required Abraham to do something to demonstrate his faith, and Abraham obeyed. And then we come to what was certainly the greatest test of all in Abraham's life. God had fulfilled the promise of a son after many years of waiting. Abraham could now see God's promise of a great nation beginning to come true. Well, God seemed to bring those hopes to an end by commanding Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Imagine such an instruction. "Abraham, take your son, the son you waited for all these years, and offer him to me as a burnt sacrifice." What did Abraham do? He immediately made preparations, and he went to Mount Moriah, he and Isaac. When they came to the place of the sacrifice, we read these words, verses 7 through 8. And we often think of Isaac just being a little fellow when this happened. No, he's at least a teenager. And Isaac, he was smart. Okay, we've got the wood and we've got the fire. Where's the sacrifice? He said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "Fire and wood are here. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Well, Abraham built the altar. He arranged the wood. He bound Isaac. He prepared to slay him. But Abraham, we find, believed that God would still keep his promises. As we read again in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offering will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. As we read in Genesis chapter 22, as Abraham is about ready to offer Isaac, he is stopped. Verses 11 and 12. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." Here I am, he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." I believe that God knew all along how this was going to end up. But Abraham needed to be put to the test. And he passed the test, we might say with flying colors. Abraham showed that he was willing to obey any command of God. God requires us to obey him. We must do more than believe. In James chapter 2, James observes the demons also believe and shudder. They know who Jesus is, they believe in him, but that's all they're willing to do. Just saying, "Lord, I believe in you," will not save us. Like Abraham, we must obey God as well as having faith in him. Faith without obedience is useless. As James writes, chapter 2, verse 17, "Even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." And in verse 20, "Faith without works is useless." Again, these are not works in the sense we sometimes think of as doing something to earn salvation, works of merit. Some think, Martin Luther was among them, thought that Paul and James disagreed about how we receive salvation. They did not. Paul, in saying we're not saved by works, was saying doing something to earn our salvation. James, in using works, was simply saying we show our salvation by faith, by doing what God says. Our life will be better if we obey God's commands. Faith and obedience will give us the best life here, and it will prepare us for the best life in eternity, in heaven with God. Yes, Abraham was satisfied with life. He was full of years. Faith and obedience help to bring about that satisfaction. We might ask ourselves, am I truly satisfied with life? When I die, could it be said of me that I was satisfied, that I was full? Now, not everything in this life is going to be perfect. That's one of the things of looking forward to the next life, where we will have perfection. In this life, we will have hardships. Not all of our wants will be satisfied. But we look forward to something far better. The policy of many businesses has been, well, you're completely satisfied or we'll give you your money back. Serving God will give true satisfaction. Nothing else that we can do in life will do that. God made us, God designed us, God has given us instructions on how to live the best life here and prepare for the best life in eternity. In living for God, a life of faith and obedience, we will be completely satisfied here and hereafter.